The satellite feed flickered across the briefing room monitors, showing nothing but empty desert stretching toward the Syrian border. General Martinez rubbed his tired eyes, the weight of 48 hours without sleep pressing down like a physical force. The rescue team should have been back by now. Should have been back 12 hours ago. "Sir, we've lost all communication with Bravo team," the communications officer reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Last transmission was at 300 hours. They were pinned down, requesting immediate air support." Martinez stared at the grainy footage from the drone circling overhead. Somewhere in that maze of rocky outcroppings and abandoned buildings, 8 of his best soldiers were either dead or dying. The mission had seemed straightforward: extract a high-value intelligence asset from a compound near the border. Clean, quick, surgical. But nothing ever went according to plan in this god-forsaken corner of the world. The enemy had been waiting. The intelligence was wrong, or worse, compromised. What should have been a 30-minute operation had turned into a nightmare that stretched through the night and into the blazing heat of another desert dawn. The quick reaction force was still 4 hours out, too far to make any difference. The Apache gunships were grounded with mechanical issues. Even the drones were running low on fuel and ammunition. "Options?" Martinez asked, though he already knew the answer. There weren't any good ones left. "We could try another drone strike, sir, but with our people so close to enemy positions." The tactical officer's voice trailed off. They all knew what that meant. In the chaos of urban combat, precision strikes became rolling dice with American lives. The room fell silent except for the steady hum of electronics and the distant rumble of jets taking off from the main runway. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and with each passing minute, the chances of bringing Bravo team home alive diminished like shadows at noon. Then, cutting through the static on the emergency frequency, a voice crackled to life. Calm, steady, with just a hint of southern drawl that somehow made it sound like she was ordering coffee instead of requesting coordinates for a hot zone. "Tower, this is Reaper 6. I'm 20 minutes out and show friendly forces in distress, requesting immediate clearance for close air support mission." Martinez grabbed the radio handset, his pulse quickening. "Reaper 6 Tower, what's your aircraft type and payload?" "Tower, Reaper 6. Single A-10’s Thunderbolt, full combat load. 30mm Mavericks and enough attitude to ruin someone's whole day." Something in that voice, in the quiet confidence that seemed to emanate through the radio waves, made Martinez pause. He'd heard that tone before, from pilots who'd been places and done things that left invisible scars. The satellite feed showed movement in the compound, muzzle flashes, smoke rising from what had been their extraction point. Time was running out, and help had just announced itself with the call sign of death itself. Captain Alina, Reaper, Vasquez had been flying combat missions since before most of the soldiers in that briefing room had finished basic training. She'd earned her call sign the hard way, during the early days of the Iraq War, when close air support meant getting low and dirty with the enemy, when the difference between life and death was measured in feet rather than miles. The A-10 Thunderbolt II beneath her was scarred and weathered, its titanium bathtub cockpit bearing the marks of countless missions. The aircraft's nose art, a grim Reaper holding scales instead of a scythe, had faded over the years, but the meaning behind it remained sharp. Balance, justice, the final arbitration when all other options were exhausted. Alina had been on her way back from a routine patrol when the emergency call came through. Technically, she was running low on fuel, operating at the edge of her safety margins. Technically, she should have continued back to base, logged her flight hours, and let someone else handle the rescue. But Alina had learned long ago that technically was a luxury that ground troops couldn't afford. She banked the Thunderbolt toward the coordinates, feeling the familiar weight of the aircraft respond to her touch. The A-10 wasn't the fastest or prettiest fighter in the Air Force inventory, but it was built for exactly this kind of work: close support, danger close, when American soldiers needed someone willing to fly into hell and clear a path back out. The radio crackled again. Reaper 6, be advised, friendly forces are danger close to enemy positions. Visual identification will be difficult. Alina's response was immediate. Copy, Tower. Danger close is where I do my best work. Below her, the desert landscape began to shift and change as she approached the border region. Rocky hills gave way to scattered buildings and the geometric lines of human settlement. Somewhere in that maze, 8 Americans were fighting for their lives, probably wondering if anyone remembered they existed. Alina had been that soldier once, pinned down in a firefight that seemed to stretch on forever, watching the sky and praying for the distinctive silhouette of an A-10 to appear overhead. She knew what it felt like to hear your ammunition running low, to see the enemy closing in, to wonder if you'd ever see home again. That was why she'd volunteered for this deployment, even though her squadron commander had raised eyebrows at her request. At 34, Alina was older than most combat pilots, old enough to be thinking about staff positions and career progression rather than danger-close missions over hostile territory. But staff work meant other people would be making the life-and-death decisions, and Alina had seen too many of those decisions go wrong. She checked her instruments again, calculating fuel consumption against mission requirements. She had enough for 1 good gun run, maybe 2 if she was careful. After that, she'd be committed to the mission regardless of what happened on the ground. The radio came alive with frantic chatter. Ground forces calling for immediate air support, their voices tight with stress and the particular kind of fear that came from being outnumbered and running out of options. In the briefing room, General Martinez watched the satellite feed with growing tension. The enemy forces were massing for what looked like a final assault on Bravo Team's position. Heat signatures showed at least 30 hostiles moving through the compound, using the maze of buildings to mask their approach. The Americans were trapped in a single structure, their defensive perimeter shrinking with each passing minute. Reaper 6 Tower, how do you want to work this? Martinez asked, his voice betraying none of the desperation he felt. Alina's response was calm, professional. Tower, I'll need you to mark friendly positions with strobes. I'm going to come in from the northeast, use the ridge line to mask my approach. Once I start my run, those friendlies need to keep their heads down. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Alina would have to fly her through a narrow valley below the level of the surrounding hills to avoid detection by enemy air defenses. Then, at the last possible moment, she'd pull up and attack the compound, identifying targets and threats in the few seconds she had before committing to her gun run. It was the kind of flying that required not just skill, but instinct, the ability to process information faster than conscious thought, to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between saving lives and ending them. Alina had been doing it for 15 years, but it never got easier. If anything, experience had taught her just how many things could go wrong in those crucial moments when aircraft met ground fire. She could see the compound now, a cluster of low buildings surrounded by walls and defensive positions. Smoke was rising from several points, and even from altitude, she could see the muzzle flashes of automatic weapons fire. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Tower Reaper 6, I have visual on the target area, beginning my approach. Alina pushed the stick forward, diving toward the desert floor. The A-10 responded like the war machine it was built to be, trading altitude for speed as she lined up for her attack run. The landscape blurred past her canopy, rock formations and scrub brush merging into a brown and tan kaleidoscope. This was what she lived for, the moment when all the training, all the preparation, all the theoretical knowledge transformed into action. When the machine beneath her became an extension of her will, and her will was focused on one simple objective, bringing Americans home alive. Behind her, the sun climbed higher into the desert sky. Ahead, 8 soldiers waited for salvation that wore the shape of an A-10 Thunderbolt and carried the call sign of death itself. The compound rushed toward her at 300 miles per hour. The first thing Alina noticed as she screamed over the ridge line was the smoke. Thick, black columns rising from multiple points within the compound, the kind of smoke that came from burning vehicles and ammunition cook-offs. The second thing she noticed was the muzzle flashes, too many of them, coming from positions that formed a tightening noose around a single building in the center of the complex. Tower Reaper 6. I count at least 40 hostiles, multiple heavy weapons positions. Friendlies appear to be contained in structure center of compound. Alina's voice remained steady despite the gravity of the situation unfolding beneath her, requesting immediate marking of friendly positions. The response came back immediately. Reaper 6, friendlies are strobing now, building with the red roof center courtyard. Alina banked hard left, gaining altitude to set up her attack run. Through her targeting pod, she could see the infrared strobes flashing from the windows of the designated building. 8 heat signatures clustered in defensive positions, their body armor and equipment clearly visible through the thermal imaging system. The enemy positions were easier to identify. They moved with the confidence of hunters closing in on prey, advancing through the compound's maze of alleyways and defensive positions. Several technical vehicles, pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, were positioned to provide covering fire. Most concerning were the RPG teams she could see maneuvering to get clear shots at the Americans' position. Alina had perhaps 90 seconds before those RPG teams would be in position to finish the job. Tower Reaper 6 is in hot. She rolled the A-10 inverted and pulled through into a steep dive, the compound growing larger in her heads-up display with each passing second. The familiar feel of G-forces pressed her into her ejection seat as she aligned the aircraft's nose with the largest concentration of enemy forces. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon was built around a simple principle: overwhelming firepower applied with surgical precision. 30mm depleted uranium rounds fired at a rate of 3,900 per minute, each round capable of penetrating tank armor. Against personnel and light vehicles, the effect was devastating and immediate. Alina squeezed the trigger. The sound was distinctive, a deep, resonant brrrrt that could be heard for miles, like the roar of an angry dragon. The recoil from the cannon actually slowed the aircraft's forward progress, the massive gun firing projectiles that weighed nearly a pound each. Below, the enemy positions simply disintegrated. The technical vehicles exploded in balls of flame and twisted metal. Fighting positions carved into the compound's walls collapsed under the impact of multiple 30 rounds. Bodies that had been moving with lethal purpose moments before simply ceased to exist. Alina pulled up hard, clearing the compound's walls by mere feet, feeling the A-10 shudder as small arms fire peppered her aircraft's armored hull. The titanium bathtub that surrounded her cockpit was designed to withstand exactly this kind of punishment, but the sound of bullets striking metal was never something a pilot got used to. Tower Reaper 6 off target. Good hits on multiple hostiles. Assessing battle damage. Alina rolled into a climbing turn, positioning herself for another attack run while checking her aircraft systems. Engine temperatures normal, hydraulics responding properly, no warning lights in the cockpit. The radio crackled with excitement from the ground. Reaper 6, Bravo Team Actual, outstanding work. You just eliminated at least 20 hostiles in those technical vehicles. We've got clear fields of fire now. But Alina could see through her targeting pod that the fight was far from over. More enemy forces were moving through the outer sections of the compound, and she'd spotted something that made her blood run cold: the distinctive outline of a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile launcher. Alina had been flying the A-10 long enough to know that ground-to-air threats were the one thing that could turn a successful mission into a memorial service. The Thunderbolt was built to absorb punishment, but even its legendary toughness had limits. A direct hit from a modern anti-aircraft missile could end both her mission and her life in a matter of seconds. Tower Reaper 6. I've got SAM threats in the area. Going to need to adjust my approach. Alina's training kicked in automatically. Vary your attack patterns. Never give the enemy a predictable target. Stay low and fast when possible. She set up for a second gun run, this time approaching from the southwest, using the compound's own buildings to mask her approach from the missile team she'd spotted. The A-10 responded to her touch like the well-trained warhorse it was, diving toward the desert floor before pulling up at the last second to clear a wall by inches. This run was different. As she lined up her shots, Alina could see individual enemy fighters clearly through her heads-up display. Young men, most of them, carrying AK-47s and wearing the mixed military and civilian clothing that marked them as irregular forces. For a split second, she could see their faces turned upward toward her aircraft, expressions caught between determination and terror. Alina had long ago made peace with the moral complexities of her job. These men had chosen to engage American forces, had chosen to put her countrymen's lives at risk. When she pressed the trigger, she wasn't thinking about their hopes or fears or families. She was thinking about 8 Americans who wanted to go home alive. The 30 cannon roared again, its distinctive sound echoing off the compound's walls. More enemy positions disappeared in clouds of dust and debris. An ammunition stockpile somewhere in the complex detonated in a secondary explosion that sent a mushroom cloud of smoke and flame hundreds of feet into the air. Alina pulled off target again, this time taking fire from multiple directions. Tracers streaked past her canopy, bright green lines that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before disappearing. Something heavier, probably a 23 anti-aircraft gun, opened up from a position she hadn't spotted on her previous runs. The rounds came uncomfortably close, close enough that Alina could hear them passing through the air around her aircraft. One struck her left wing, punching a hole through the metal but missing anything critical. The A-10 was designed to bring its pilot home even after sustaining massive damage, but Alina knew that luck was a finite resource. Reaper 6 Tower, what's your fuel and ammunition status? Alina checked her gauges. Tower, I've got about 15 minutes of fuel remaining and maybe 100 rounds in the gun. I can give you one more good run, then I need to start thinking about getting home. Below her, the battle continued. The enemy forces had taken significant casualties, but they weren't retreating. If anything, they seemed to be regrouping for another assault on the Americans' position. Alina could see them moving through the compound's outer buildings, using covered approaches to avoid her gun. In the briefing room, General Martinez watched the satellite feed with mixed emotions. The A-10's intervention had clearly saved Bravo team from immediate annihilation, but the situation remained desperate. The enemy still held most of the compound, and Alina's fuel limitations meant she couldn't maintain air support indefinitely. "Sir," the communications officer reported, "the quick reaction force is still 3 hours out. Apache gunships are still down for maintenance." Martinez felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He was watching 8 of his soldiers fight for their lives, supported by a single pilot in an aircraft that was running low on fuel and ammunition. The mathematics of warfare were unforgiving. Alina could buy them time, but she couldn't single-handedly win the battle. Reaper 6 Tower, we're working on getting you additional support, but it's going to take time. Can you keep those hostiles suppressed until help arrives? Alina's response was immediate, but Martinez could hear something new in her voice. Not fear exactly, but the kind of cold calculation that came from facing impossible odds. "Tower, I'll stay as long as I can. But you need to know, after this next run, I'll be flying on fumes. If I don't head home soon, you're going to have one more American on the ground to rescue." The implication was clear. Alina was willing to push her aircraft to its absolute limits, to risk her own life to buy time for the soldiers below. It was the kind of decision that defined careers and lives, the moment when duty transcended self-preservation. In the compound below, Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez pressed himself against a bullet-scarred wall and tried to make sense of the situation. 20 minutes ago, his team had been pinned down and facing certain death. Then that A-10 had appeared like an angel of destruction, its cannon tearing through enemy positions with surgical precision. Rodriguez had been in the Army for 12 years, had served multiple deployments in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He'd seen close air support before, had worked with F-16s and Apache helicopters, and even the occasional AC-130 gunship. But he'd never seen flying like this, the pilot bringing that big, ugly A-10 so close to the ground that it seemed impossible, threading the needle between friendly and enemy positions with accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. "Who is that pilot?" Rodriguez shouted to his team leader over the sound of gunfire. "Call sign Reaper 6, came the response. "Whoever she is, she just saved our asses." Rodriguez felt a moment of surprise at the pronoun. Female combat pilots were still relatively rare, especially in close air support roles. But whoever was flying that A-10 knew their business with a competence that transcended gender or any other demographic consideration. The radio in Rodriguez's ear crackled to life. "Bravo team, Reaper 6. I'm setting up for one more gun run, then I'll need to head home for fuel. Make this count. After I leave, you're going to be on your own for a while." Rodriguez keyed his radio. "Reaper 6, Bravo team actual, we copy. What do you need from us?" "Mark the biggest threat with smoke if you can. I'll put everything I have left into whatever you designate." Rodriguez looked around at his team's position. They were down to their last few magazines of ammunition, their radio was damaged, and they'd been awake for nearly 24 hours straight. But they were still alive, still fighting, and that was entirely due to the pilot circling overhead in an aircraft that looked like it had been built in someone's garage from spare tank parts. "Copy, Reaper 6. There's a building at the northwest corner of the compound. Looks like they're using it as a command post. Heavy weapons position on the roof." "I see it," Alina's voice came back immediately. "That's going to be danger close for you. How close can you get to your basement?" Rodriguez looked at the building Alina was describing. It was maybe 50 meters from their position, close enough that the blast from 30 rounds would shower them with debris and dust. But it was also the position that posed the greatest threat to their survival. "Well, get low, Reaper. Do what you need to do." Alina set up for her final attack run, knowing that everything depended on the next 60 seconds. She'd been in similar situations before, but familiarity didn't make them any less terrifying. Flying an aircraft that was designed for close support was one thing. Flying it when your fuel gauge was nudging the red line and your ammunition counter was showing double digits was something else entirely. She rolled into her attack dive, the compound rushing up to meet her once again. This time, she could see the enemy position that Rodriguez had marked, a 2-story building with sandbags on the roof and the muzzle flashes of a heavy machine gun clearly visible. Alina lined up her shot with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that this was her last chance to make a difference. The 13 cannon spun up to firing speed, the aircraft's computer systems calculating range and trajectory with electronic precision. She squeezed the trigger and held it down, expending the last of her ammunition in a sustained burst that lasted nearly 5 seconds. The building simply collapsed, its walls and roof disintegrating under the impact of more than 300 rounds of depleted uranium. Alina pulled up and away from the compound, her aircraft's engines already beginning to feel the effects of extended high-power operation on low fuel. Behind her, smoke and dust marked the end of her intervention in the battle below. Tower Reaper 6 off target, Winchester on ammunition and bingo fuel, returning to base. The radio was quiet for a moment, then General Martinez's voice came through. Reaper 6 Tower, outstanding work. You've given our people a fighting chance. As Alina climbed away from the battlefield, she could see the results of her work spread across the compound below. Enemy vehicles burned like torches, their smoke columns marking the graves of those who had threatened American lives. The building that had housed the enemy command post was simply gone, replaced by a crater that would be visible from satellite imagery for years to come. But Alina knew that her work was only the beginning. Somewhere behind her, 8 Americans were still fighting for their lives, still waiting for rescue that might never come. She'd bought them time and space, but time was a finite resource and space meant nothing without the people to hold it. Alina's fuel warning light flickered on as she turned toward home. The flight back to base gave Alina time to think, something she usually tried to avoid after missions like this. Thinking led to questions, and questions led to doubt, and doubt was a luxury that combat pilots couldn't afford. But with the A-10 droning along at cruise power, the desert landscape sliding past beneath her wings, it was impossible not to replay the mission in her mind. She'd done everything right, followed all the procedures, applied her firepower with the precision and restraint that years of training had ingrained in her. But she also knew that her intervention, however effective in the short term, was only a temporary solution. The mathematics of warfare were unforgiving. 8 Americans against an unknown number of enemies, in hostile territory, with limited ammunition and no clear evacuation plan. The radio had been quiet for the past 10 minutes, which could mean any number of things. Maybe Bravo Team was consolidating their position, taking advantage of the breathing space Alina had provided. Maybe they were moving to a more defensible location, or maybe they were all dead, victims of a counterattack that came too quickly for anyone to report. Alina pushed the thought away and focused on her instruments. Her fuel situation was becoming critical. She had enough to reach base with standard reserves, but if she encountered any problems, any need to divert or attempt multiple approaches, she'd be in serious trouble. The A-10 was famous for its ability to fly home on one engine, with half its control surfaces shot away, but it couldn't fly home without fuel. Her radio crackled to life. Reaper 6 Tower, we've been monitoring your fuel status. You're cleared straight into runway 27, emergency vehicles standing by as precautionary. Tower Reaper 6, I'm not declaring an emergency, just running a little light on gas. Copy, Reaper 6. Understand you're not declaring, but we're treating this as priority handling anyway. Alina smiled despite herself. Air traffic controllers were the same everywhere, cautious to the point of paranoia, which was probably why she'd never seen a mid-air collision in 15 years of military flying. They'd have fire trucks and ambulances lined up along the runway, just in case her fuel situation was worse than she was reporting. As the base came into view on the horizon, Alina allowed herself a moment of relief. She'd completed another mission, put her skills and training to use in service of something larger than herself. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that somewhere behind her, the fight was continuing. While she flew home to a hot meal and a soft bed, 8 soldiers were still trapped in a hostile compound, still depending on help that might not arrive in time. Alina had been in the military long enough to understand that this was the nature of modern warfare. Victories measured in minutes rather than months. Success defined by the number of Americans who made it home alive rather than territory captured or enemy forces destroyed. It was a more personal kind of warfare, where individual actions could mean the difference between life and death for specific, identifiable people. She thought about Rodriguez and his team, wondered if they had families waiting for them, if they'd joined the army for the same reason she'd joined the Air Force. A mixture of patriotism and pragmatism, the desire to serve something larger than themselves combined with the practical need for education and career opportunities. Most service members, Alina had learned, were motivated by surprisingly ordinary concerns: steady pay, health insurance, job training, and the chance to see the world. But when the shooting started, those ordinary motivations transformed into something extraordinary. Soldiers who joined the army to learn computer skills found themselves carrying wounded comrades under fire. Pilots who'd wanted to fly fast jets ended up flying slow, ugly attack aircraft into hostile territory. The military, Alina reflected, had a way of revealing character that civilian life rarely demanded. The runway was clearly visible now, its concrete surface shimmering in the heat of the desert afternoon. Alina began her approach, configuring the A-10 for landing while monitoring her fuel gauges with increasing attention. She'd made it with fuel to spare, but not by much. As the aircraft settled onto the runway with the characteristic heavy thump of a machine built for durability rather than elegance, Alina allowed herself a moment to appreciate the simple pleasure of being on the ground and alive. The A-10 rolled out, its engines spooling down from the high-pitched whine of approach power to the lower rumble of taxi thrust. She was directed to a parking spot near the maintenance hangar, where a ground crew was already waiting to begin post-flight inspection and refueling. As Alina shut down the engines and began the process of securing the aircraft, she could see the crew chief walking around the plane, examining the bullet holes in her left wing with professional interest. "How'd she fly, Captain?" the senior enlisted man asked as Alina climbed down from the cockpit. "Like a Rolls-Royce with an attitude problem," Alina replied, using one of her favorite descriptions of the A-10. "Took some small arms fire, but nothing that affected flight characteristics." The crew chief nodded and made notes on his clipboard. Bullet holes were a routine part of A-10 maintenance. The aircraft was designed to absorb battle damage and continue flying. The maintenance crews had become experts at patching holes, replacing damaged components, and getting war-weary aircraft ready for the next mission. Alina gathered her flight gear and headed toward the operations building for her post-mission debrief. The intelligence officers would want to know everything she'd observed: enemy positions, weapons types, the effectiveness of her attack runs, and her assessment of the overall tactical situation. It was routine paperwork that transformed life-and-death combat into neat categories and statistical summaries. But as Alina walked across the tarmac, her mind kept drifting back to the radio calls she'd heard during the mission. The controlled desperation in Rodriguez's voice, the professional calm of General Martinez, the way her own voice had sounded when she'd reported being Winchester, out of ammunition, and bingo fuel. Those voices represented real people in extreme situations, making decisions that would define the rest of their lives, assuming they had lives left to define. Alina had been lucky. She'd done her job, applied her training and experience to a tactical problem, and flown home safely to do it again another day. But luck was a finite resource in combat aviation, and Alina knew that her luck account was perhaps running lower than her fuel had been. She thought about retirement, about the staff position she'd been offered at Air Force headquarters, about the comfortable routine of briefing slides and budget meetings and personnel evaluations. It would be easier work, safer work, the kind of assignment that led to promotion and a comfortable pension. But it would also mean that other pilots would be flying the dangerous missions, taking the risks, making the split-second decisions that kept soldiers like Rodriguez alive. Alina wasn't sure she was ready to hand over that responsibility to someone else, wasn't sure she could live with herself if she chose safety over service when Americans were dying overseas. The operations building was air-conditioned and fluorescently lit, a sterile environment that seemed to exist in a different universe from the heat and smoke and gunfire she'd left behind an hour earlier. Alina found the intelligence section and knocked on the door frame. "Captain Vasquez, reporting for debrief, sir." The intelligence officer, a young lieutenant who looked like he'd graduated from college about 15 minutes earlier, looked up from his computer screen with the expression of someone who was genuinely excited to be doing his job. "Captain, great timing. We've been monitoring the situation through satellite feeds and signals intelligence. Your intervention appears to have been extremely effective. We're seeing a significant reduction in enemy activity around the compound. Alina took a seat and began the familiar ritual of post-mission reporting. Grid coordinates, target descriptions, ammunition expenditure, observed battle damage assessment. The facts and figures that would be compiled into reports, fed into computer databases, and used to evaluate the effectiveness of close air support doctrine. But Alina knew that the most important aspects of the mission couldn't be quantified or categorized. The moment when she decided to push her fuel limits to help soldiers in trouble. The split-second decisions that meant the difference between hitting enemy positions and hitting friendly forces. The professional satisfaction of applying 15 years of training and experience to save American lives. As she finished her debrief and prepared to head back to her quarters, Alina's radio buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen and felt her pulse quicken. All available aircraft, emergency tasking. Bravo team under renewed attack, requesting immediate close air support. Alina looked at the message timestamp. The enemy counterattack had begun less than 30 minutes after she'd left the area. Rodriguez and his team were fighting for their lives again. Alina was halfway back to the flight line before she realized she'd made the decision to respond. Her A-10 was being refueled and rearmed, but the process would take at least another hour. By then, it might be too late for the soldiers trapped in the compound. She keyed her radio as she jogged toward the operations center. Tower, Reaper 6. I'm available for immediate launch if you need me back out there. The response came back immediately. Reaper 6, negative. You're not scheduled for another mission for 6 hours. We have other assets responding. Alina stopped running and stood in the middle of the tarmac, feeling the weight of regulations and procedures pressing down on her like physical chains. Flight time limitations, crew rest requirements, aircraft maintenance schedules, all the administrative machinery that kept military aviation safe and effective was also the machinery that might get 8 Americans killed. Tower, what assets are responding to the emergency? There was a pause before the answer came back. Reaper 6, we have F-16s en route, estimated time to target 45 minutes. Alina knew what that meant. The F-16s were fast and powerful, but they weren't designed for close air support. They flew high and fast, dropping precision munitions from altitude, but they couldn't provide the kind of intimate, danger-close support that ground troops sometimes needed. They were the right tool for many jobs, but not necessarily for this job. Alina made a decision that would define the rest of her career. Tower, Reaper 6. I'm declaring a maintenance emergency and requesting immediate launch authority. It was a lie, and everyone who heard the radio call knew it was a lie. Alina's aircraft was mechanically sound, her crew rest was adequate, and she had no official authorization to fly another mission. But it was also the lie that might save 8 American lives. The radio was quiet for a long moment, then General Martinez's voice came through. Reaper 6 Tower, approved for immediate launch, maintenance emergency understood and logged. Alina smiled grimly as she ran toward her aircraft. Martinez was covering for her, providing the official fiction that would protect them both if anyone asked questions later. It was the kind of leadership that put mission accomplishment ahead of personal career considerations, and Alina felt a surge of respect for the general who was willing to bend regulations to support his troops. The ground crew was surprised to see her return, but military personnel were trained to adapt to changing circumstances. Within 15 minutes, they had the A-10 refueled and loaded with a fresh supply of 30 ammunition. Alina completed her pre-flight inspection with the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing that lives depended on her attention to detail. As she strapped into the cockpit and began the engine start sequence, Alina allowed herself to acknowledge what she was really doing. She was risking her career, her reputation, and potentially her life to help soldiers she'd never met, in a war that most Americans had stopped paying attention to years earlier. But she was also doing exactly what she'd sworn to do when she'd accepted her commission 15 years earlier: support and defend the Constitution of the United States and protect the men and women who served under that same oath. The A-10's engine spooled up to taxi power, and Alina began the familiar ritual of pre-takeoff checks. Outside her cockpit, the desert sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and orange that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Alina keyed her radio. "Tower, Reaper 6 ready for takeoff." "Reaper 6 Tower, cleared for takeoff, winds calm, good hunting." Alina advanced the throttles and felt the A-10 begin its roll down the runway. The aircraft accelerated with the steady, purposeful momentum of a machine built for war, lifting off the desert floor and climbing toward a sky that was already beginning to darken with the approach of another Middle Eastern night. Behind her, the base fell away into the distance. Ahead, 8 Americans waited for salvation that wore the shape of an A-10 Thunderbolt and carried the call sign of death itself. Again, the compound looked different in the late afternoon light, shadows lengthening across the courtyard and walls as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Alina approached from a different angle this time, using the changing light conditions to mask her aircraft's approach from any remaining anti-aircraft threats. Through her targeting pod, she could see that the situation had deteriorated significantly since her departure. The building where Bravo team had been making their stand was now partially collapsed, its walls showing fresh damage from what appeared to be rocket-propelled grenades. Worse, she could see enemy forces moving through positions that had been clear when she'd left. "Tower, Reaper 6 on station, requesting immediate update on friendly positions." The response was immediate and grim. "Reaper 6, friendlies have been forced to relocate to the basement of the center building. Enemy forces have occupied most of the compound. Situation is critical." Alina could see it for herself through her sensors. Heat signatures that clearly indicated enemy personnel were moving through the upper floors of the building where the Americans were trapped. It was no longer a siege. It was the final phase of an assault, with the enemy literally on top of the friendly positions. "Tower, I need precise friendly locations. This is going to be danger close beyond anything in the manual." "Reaper 6, friendlies are in the basement, northeast corner of the building. Enemy forces are on floors 1 and 2, same building." Alina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude or air conditioning in her cockpit. She was being asked to attack a building that contained both American soldiers and enemy.